Hi, I'm Michelle Rothrock. I'm currently at the Getty Research Institute as an intern with the vocabulary program, but today I'm presenting the outcomes of a project I completed the last academic year when I was a fellow at the New York Public Library Digital Archives program to assess the quality of their optical media workflow. I am joined by Alison, Rhonemus, and Nick Krabbenhoeft, who is in the chat, both from New York Public Library.
My name is Alison Rhonemus, and I will be presenting how NYPL works with large acquisitions of optical media. The Digital Archives program at NYPL is responsible for digital carriers from archival acquisitions by NYPL research libraries, such as libraries of the performing arts, the Schomburg Center, and manuscripts and rare books. When the Digital Archives program started in 2011, the primary workflow was forensic imaging of floppy disks. In the past 10 years, the portfolio of work has grown in scale and diversity, now including things like large optical media collections. The photo in the slide shows the current setup of our lab. You can see many computer monitors. In the back, there's a cabinet with our cord collection. And in the very middle of the left, you might see the gray box of the Nimbie, which we will speak about later. Next slide, please. Recently, NYPL has acquired collections from a time period when CD backups were a popular digital storage strategy. For example, in a theater photographer's collection that spanned from the 1980s into the mid-2010s, the photographer had kept a copy of all shots. Until about 2004, this was an envelope of negatives. After that point, it was a CD or DVD of JPEGs or raw images. This collection includes almost 5,000 optical media. The photo shows one of the collection's 12 boxes of optical media. On the left, you can see a gray box with many sleeves containing many CDs. Before we received large collections of optical media, we would image or transfer one disc at a time. But with thousands of CDRs, working one at a time would mean a lot of staff time. And on the right of the slide, you can see a movie of a CD tray moving in and out of a computer disk. Next slide, please. To deal with this increase in scale, NYPL adapted the IROM software, IROMLAB, published by Johan van der Knijf at the KBNL, the National Library of the Netherlands. The approach uses a disk robot called a Nimbie, pictured here. You can see it on the left. It looks like a gray plastic box with some green lights on the front, and there is an open circle in the middle, and through that open circle, you can see the disk tray of a Blu-ray drive. 100 disks can be loaded into the Nimbie, read one by one, and then dropped out of the bottom. Because IROM is an open source project, we were able to change its functionality to our needs. We added new metadata fields and captured FAGs instead of ISOs. This process decreased our transfer times by over 90% and is now our standard optical media transfer method. Next slide.
So this batch transfer process still had some unknowns when I first started. And those were, without reviewing every transferred file, how do we know if the transfers are successful and complete? How do we know if the files are intact and readable? How can we troubleshoot the unsuccessful transfers? The software generated some metadata about the transfers, but it didn't easily point to failures like the photo on this slide. And this photo shows two costumed actors posing, and it's kind of cut up, distorted, discolored, probably from a scratch on the disc. So over 2 semesters of work, I tried to answer some of these questions. So when you run that batch transfer process that Alison just described, you get a few things out of it. On the whole batch level, you get a batch manifest file, which gives basic info about each disk transferred, including whether or not the transfer failed, though this does only note when the disk fails to read entirely. You also get a folder per disk, which contains metadata about the transfer and the actual transferred files. The image on this slide shows a sample of the folders and files that would be generated or read from a single disk. We have some metadata files here generated by Baggett, the TXT files you can see on the image. We have the actual photos that were on the disk, and then we have some additional metadata files, the transfer and CD info logs. So those metadata files, specifically the transfer, CD info, and bag info files, contained our best bet for finding some info about the success of the transfer. The challenge was to actually make this information usable without checking each one, which would very much defeat the purpose of working in a batch to begin with. So to gather the metadata stored in all of these separate files and start to get a picture of what was actually transferred, I wrote a script in Python. Initially, I wasn't quite sure exactly what info was available in these logs, so I chose a few things that were available in every log file. That included the size of the data on the original disk, the size of the files actually retrieved and the count of the files, and the start and end times for each transfer. So first I checked through this info to look for outliers. That included mismatches between the data on the disk and the data actually transferred, and disks with really long transfer times. By examining just these outliers, I was able to find that one of the log files was actually generating a list of files that failed. And this ultimately was the most useful piece of info for us. So once I gathered this info, I found that overall, the Nimbie and IRM lab did a really, really good job, as you might imagine from seeing that tiny sliver of red on this chart here. And this is a chart showing the percentages of successful and failed transfers looking at individual files. So out of transfers that made up the sample I was looking at, only 0.3% of the total number of files transferred failed, like that photo that I showed a couple of slides ago. So just 64 out of over the 3,000 disks in the sample contained failures. So I pulled out those 64 disks and manually inspected them, looking at physical damage, the cleanliness of the disk, looking at files and file systems on the disk using ISOBuster, and looking at the files that were actually transferred just to double check the quality and to see that everything was present. And after this inspection, I would try to see if I could recover any additional data from the disks using either ISOBuster or DD-Rescue to create a disk image. So I found that there were two general issues I would see on these 64 disks. One was straightforward damage. The disk would be visibly scratched and it would be difficult to read. Trying to recover additional data from these disks often took hours. One test in DD-Rescue ran for over 10 days before we finally killed it. And maybe we'd get an additional photo or two out of it, and maybe we wouldn't even get that. The other issue that popped up was related to the file systems. There were a few different types of errors that we found here, but generally this had to do with the way the files were named or stored on the disk. ISOBuster, with its ability to interpret a huge variety of media formats and file systems, could recover files perfectly from these disks with file system issues. And on this slide, I just have a chart showing the proportion of damaged disks to file system issues. Looks like we had way more file system issues than damaged disks. So the outcomes here were, one, finding out that overall this batch transfer process worked really well. It's tough to say that, yeah, we think we have all of the photos off these disks, but we didn't check each transfer, so we're not totally sure. And this project really gives us the confidence to say that the batch transfer process was a really good match for this collection. And as a new professional, this was actually a major takeaway for me. When trying a new process and new workflow, I think it can be tempting to assume or hope for the best, but really taking the time to check our assumptions was really useful here. Because we did that, we can make an improvement to the transfer workflow going forward too. The script that I wrote can be repurposed a little. New York Public Library is currently working on adding it into its fork so that a report can be produced to tell a user about incomplete transfers. And then from there, the failed disks can be identified and manually troubleshooted using the same process that I had tried out earlier. I also wrote about this project in more detail for Code for Lib Journal. So we have a link on the slide to that here, as well as some links to New York Public Library's workflows and usage of Iron Lab. So those are available for your further reading. And that has been our presentation. Thanks so much for your time, and we will be taking questions now.